I can't hear.
And if you're speaking, you are muted.
Sorry, I hadn't quite started speaking. We just need to change the slide to this report back guidance, addressing those two questions. So first, focusing on what principle or principles did you elevate as being the most essential within your region, but also the state. And then either how have you seen it implemented, or how could you see it be implemented? So Emily, maybe I don't know exactly what the groups were. Could you lead in? Oh, they're sending it to me now. I think group one, we have Chanel and Nicole. So Chanel was our facilitator. Were you able to volunteer someone to be your reporter?
Yes. Nicole is going to be our reporter.
Okay. Yep. I think the principles that we were mainly talking about, we chose to sort. It was principle 1, which was acknowledging and reevaluating previous histories, and also principle 6, which was coordinating with partner agencies across internal departments, and mainly just because that we were talking about like engagement fatigue, and in terms of both on the agency side, but also as on the personal level, just being pulled into many public hearings and wanting to shift more of the burden onto the like agencies. And we're also, and then I think examples of how this principle has been played out successfully might be at the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC. I think they have a really good paper toward more equitable shorelines that talks about how first they acknowledge how approval of development has affected communities on the ground, and then they take steps to address that. And then we were also talking about how trust building is going to require us like seeing each other as human beings and kind of taking like our job position hats off, and finding like a common purpose so that we can be able to create these solutions together.
Perfect. And that was a great model of timing. We'll try to keep it somewhat short since we have several groups to get through. Our second group is another Bay Area group facilitated by Ophelia, who is your reporter.
Yeah, our reporter is Caitlin.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. So in our group, we also talked on multiple guiding principles, particularly number 2, 6, and 7. So number 2 is a recap. Require all planning processes and projects to have an authentic community relationship engagement plan. Number 6 was coordinating with partner agencies to leverage resources and staff and data to address engagement fatigue. Number 7, governments must be responsive to the interconnectedness of community concerns. So a lot of the discussion we had were interrelated amongst these 3, particularly amongst number 2 and 6 in terms of addressing the incorporation of, or shifting the conversation in the process of how engagement is currently conducted, and creating more of that holistic, continuous trust building process. I think that's where most of our conversation stemmed from, and our group members shared examples of that, and where they've seen, whether it be local planning commission or having community members kind of be included late in the game, in terms of having a say when it's already too late in terms of tangible decision-making power. And then in terms of implementation, or some examples, Odin in our group mentioned that GARE has a pretty good example of how they're kind of shifting the conversation and showing the change of engagement that is, while it's inclusive and collaborative, it's also managing that balance between robust prescriptive requirements from agencies and outside groups. I think I'll have that there.
Thank you, Caitlin. And Emily shared about GARE in the chat. Next, we have the Central Valley. We'll start with Danielle's group.
I will share out for group 3 in the San Joaquin Valley. I think going through the part 1 of the facilitation guide, realizing that there were more questions to some of the guiding principles that were outlined. But as the group was kind of thinking about just, what prioritization of the principles that were outlined, really wanting to focus in on the initial step of, where that flexibility is in the process, really acknowledging the long history of harm in the Central Valley, and really having that community buy-in. And without that, there's just a large opportunity to deepen the wounds that have already been from a long history of harm. So I think that's kind of what we have.
Thanks, Savannah. And moving on to my group, which is Central Valley, and conversations about the Sacramento and broader Sierra. Our reporter is Rebecca.
Heard a lot of the principles, but the first ones
Rebecca, can you get closer to your microphone? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So we covered a lot of the principles, but the first few that we kind of pulled out was the first principle, and we all kind of tied back to those even within the other ones that we identified. So the first one, as well as principle 6 and principle 5, but reframing that to say to provide supportive opportunities for people to be engaged. For how to implement those, we had a lot of discussion about the potential benefits of coordinating between Sigma and IRWM, going back to that engagement fatigue, and how those two policies are very interconnected, especially within the Central Valley, and yet they tend to be two very different kind of planning groups that cover a lot of the same things. We also had an example from Community Water Center of how Principle 8 can actually work in practice. That's a lot of the work that they do, of establishing a community decision-making body to inform local planning processes and supporting marginalized communities.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm seeing the theme of we can't pull out these principles individually from one another without speaking to another principle, because it's all interconnected, just as all decision-making is. I'll move on to group 5, facilitated by Bree.
Hi, and I also will be reporting out on our discussion. Our group selected number 2 ultimately, but had a lengthy conversation about number 4 as well. We really thought about what's that foundational step that could be sort of woven throughout a lot of the other principles. There's lots of priorities, I think, depending on what your location is, but we felt that number 2, if we could add that there'd be a guiding principle to the planning process, like a tool of some sort that helped us to check the boxes of what's a part of the planning process. And we also felt really strongly that reciprocity be added to this principle as well, to just sort of frame the entire thing for how we're continuing that two-way conversation and following through. I think we talked a lot about trust and time, and how both of those things are not necessarily woven through the systematic process and are really underfunded. So I think at the baseline that this be a required process and that there be some guiding principles, we can get farther in all of these other 8 topics or 7 topics.
Thanks, Bree. And Belinda, you're next.
Okay, so I'll report back on my group. So basically, we went with the principle that acknowledges and reevaluates previous histories of inequity and equitable decision making. And we believe for that to be important because, you know, in order to advance, you must first acknowledge your history. And in doing so, you're practicing transparency and accountability, in a sense. And the way that we foresee that it can be implemented would be to somehow require the explicit conversation of this principle with the public, so that you can generate some sort of list of the, you know, past wrongdoings, and for this list or something like it to be used by people who make decisions within the community, for example, planners, and so that they know that these are the things that the community has deemed to be, you know, wrong, and so that they don't, you know, engage in this sort of activity again.
Thanks, Alfonso. And last but not least, we have Brian's group, another LA region group, I believe.
Yeah, I think we switched, so it would be Belinda's group.
Yeah, we had to split into two groups. So for our report, Martha, who is on, is going to give a little summary of what we came up with.
So we picked principle number 1 that we weaved in and out of all 8 just to cover them. So one of the things that we addressed are basically a storytelling of a specific event that might have happened so that people can understand what that looks like. And so I shared a story about Sativa Water Company in Compton, and how LAVCO, which is an extension of the County Board of Supervisors, made a unilateral decision to spend public dollars to clean that water company. And then after it was cleaned, it was handed over to Suburban Water, which is a private water company. Now, you're not going to ever find a bill that exists where it talks about we're going to privatize something, but the bills that were the pre to the cleaning, all of those addressed actually the issues of why that agency needed to be cleaned, much like the other water issues in California. But specifically to Sativa, the public dollars that were spent are just that, public dollars. And then when a public agency, that was LAVCO, made a decision to hand it over to Suburban, that is privatization of water. So when we look at, you know, how people were left off, one of the big things that the community didn't get is they didn't get any discussion or any say in how that would happen. So when we don't have community agreements, and this is about public dollars, public laws, and people are left out, that no longer is public. And so they were labeled as 1,400 connections. So this is a community that's referred to as connections. And so those 1,400 connections didn't get a notice, a public notice, where they could have made a decision to keep the water rights, perhaps lease them to this private water company, or that they would have any options of what they would want to do for their community. So that to me was a story that gave an example of number 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And I think from these conversations and the report outs, we see both the regional differences, but also this clear statewide need for equitable engagement that is going to look different for different communities. So these principles are not meant to be a one-size-fits-all. They are not going to be a model that can be used as a template, that it will be molded for your region, for your efforts. I want to thank you all for participating in that and sharing back with us. I'm going to take a quick second and stop sharing my screen so that we can all take a group photo to mark our involvement at the end of this presentation. So let me stop that right here. And if you're all, I'm looking at gallery view, if you're all who are on video, got lots of beautiful faces. I'm just gonna take a few quick screenshots. So if you smile, Make sure you're looking great.
Mel, where's Felix?
Yeah, really.
We want Felix in the picture.
Hey, do you want to play in the picture?
That's
Do you want to come in? Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, Felix, and perfect. Thank you, everyone. I'll share my screen again. So we'll just kind of wrap up today. First by reminding you all that we have the opportunity to provide input on these engagement guidelines. We will absolutely be taking what we've heard, the discussions that were had, the notes that were written. We will also be sending out a survey that I think Emily will be sharing in the chat any second. In that, there's an opportunity for you to share case studies, to share your feedback. You can also email me. My address is on this slide. Contact information is within that attendee packet. These slides are linked, so you can find that there, as well as our landing page, where you can find the report that we mentioned, these draft guidelines, the future guidelines, all the resources that we'll share out, resources that were shared in the chat. We're expanding the cohort with this effort, so it's been such a pleasure to be able to host this conversation. I'm also pleased that you were able to hear from our wonderful Civic Spark fellows that engaged in all of this work. They've put a lot of effort into creating these guidelines and learning about histories of engagement and paths forward. So if you're interested in learning more about Civic Spark, you can also check out our website or email me for more information. Huge thanks to our NGO cohort, our panelists, the executive directors and NGO leads, the fellows, for engaging in this conversation, as well as for all of you participants for engaging in the chat and then also in the breakout sessions. These guidelines we really want to see move forward, and we can only do that with that engagement. With that, I think we're at time, and that's all I have. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday. The feedback surveys in the chat, we will also email it out to you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.